Can see beginning and end.
Well, our minds can't fathom.
And so how old is God?
Welcome back to Ask the Pastor, and we're back here to answer questions that we have gotten in from people in congregation or just in general. And if you have a question, put it in the comments below, and we'd love to answer your question. But today's question that we have gotten is if the world is 6,000 roughly years old, according to some theologians, then does that make God 6,000 years old? So I am Pastor Chris.
And I'm Pastor Tony.
And I will let him begin to answer that question.
Wow, thanks for that one.
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah. So I guess what we're really looking at is how old is God, right?
Right.
I mean, is God 6,000, 6 billion, 6 trillion? How old is he? So thanks for making me go first.
Absolutely. That's why I throw you under the bus.
Yeah, it's because I have no hair. That's what this is. So, so how old is God? I guess I want to start with it's not really an adequate question. Because I believe that God exists outside of time and space. And so
Right.
to even ask how old God is challenging the character of God, that he is eternal. Okay, and so because God is eternal, we can't put an age on him. And so throughout the Bible, we see examples of an eternal God and a God that has always existed and will always exist, that he's outside of time. And so how old is God isn't even a relevant question. We're talking more about the identity of God as far as an eternal God. And we see that throughout Scripture, right?
Right.
I mean, we see that at the very beginning, right? Clear back in Genesis.
Yeah. And that's actually, I was going to ask you that question. You just basically asked me that question.
Okay.
Yeah. Where do we see that? Where do we see that God is outside of time? Well, we see in Genesis 1 that there are 4 things that God creates, right? It says in the beginning, so he created the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And then it says that he created the heavens and the earth. And so we know that he created space and matter in that instance. The 4th thing that he creates in verse 1 is light. So in the beginning, he created the beginning. And as I always explain it, if you create something, you create something outside of it. Like if we create a car, like I use that example a lot, you actually start outside of the car. Or if you build any project, you start outside of it. But it gets to a point where if it's big enough, like a house or a car or something, you actually can enter into that thing and begin to still work on it and create it. And so that is why God is all-knowing, because he sees at all things at the same time, because he can step outside of time. He's not necessarily predicting the future or causing the future. He is just knowing the future because he can see it and be with it across, all space and time. How does that make sense? I have no idea. I'm not God. I can't step in and out of time, so I have no idea. And so it is interesting when you sit there and say, well, how old is God? Well, our minds can't fathom. We look at something in a linear time where God is not. He doesn't look at things linear. He steps out and just looks at the whole picture and say, that's a beautiful picture. And versus to hone in and be in the details of it. And so, yeah, he is 6,000 years old, but he's not.
Right.
Because he's timeless, but that would equate that he actually is affected by time, but he's not. And so it's just really hard to really explain. I look at, Revelation 1:8 talks about God being, he calls himself, he is the Alpha and the Omega. He is the beginning and end, but it's actually more than that. He is constant and he was always there, but it's hard for us because how do we even picture eternity? We can't fathom that. So, it's just an interesting question all the way around.
Let's go back to Genesis for a second. So, because I know you just taught this with the junior high.
Yes.
And so, by the way, if you have junior high kids, you got to get them here. Okay?
Oh, it's fun.
We're teaching them all kinds of deep stuff like how old is God? Okay. And in that, right at the beginning, God had to exist before beginning.
Right.
Right. But then even through the creation process, day 1 and day 4, you see elements of time being introduced, and God's already there. So day 1 is your, morning or evening, thus day 1. So you have the ebb and flow of a day. Day 4 is your seasons, your years, with the rotation of the moon and the sun. So God was creating time in the midst of that as well. Therefore, he can't be a created time being if he was before all of that.
Well, and that's a very good point, because if God created time from the very beginning, we measure time by day and night.
Mm-hmm.
But there in verse 1, he said there was morning, there was evening, day one. But there was no sun, no stars, no moons, no whatever. There was no actually source of light, even though light existed. Some would argue that, well, God was the source of light. Well, God didn't create himself. He created light. And so it's just fascinating. So even when we talk about time in general, how old I am, God probably looks at time very differently than what we do, because we look at them for seasons, and God even points that out in Genesis 1, right? So
Yes.
that you can know these seasons. Well, so he created these things so that we can know the passage of time, but he looks at time very differently than what we do. I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
Just to be honest, I really
I,
just
I
don't.
think of it similar to your example of building a car or building a house. If I have a timeline, remember in school we'd have the timeline of the history of America, and here's a timeline
Yeah,
written out. I look at that kind of like God looking at the existence of let's say humanity on a timeline, so He can see beginning and end, yet lives outside of that.
right,
So that same example, only the car is the timeline of Earth. So He's not necessarily controlling what the future has, but he can share with us insights, the prophets and such, because he knows what the end result is, the beginning and the end, as you said. He's looking at that entire picture. Which what excites me about that is, so that means the promises of 2,000 years ago are also my promises, because God doesn't change, time doesn't change God.
right,
Okay, my future is still intact because of Him.
right. And because of all that, and that's where we see God is consistent, and he is the
Yeah.
same yesterday, today, and forever, because he is outside of time. And we're not seeing an aged God. We're not seeing a growing God. We're seeing God as God was at the beginning and at the end, because it's the same for him. And I just look at the aspect of, he is, in a lot of ways, because of that, he is still creating, he is still interacting and tweaking his creation, not to the extreme that we might in our own projects, but we see God interacting with his creation. So a God that loves to be with, to live in his creation and outside his creation, to inspect it. That we see that clearly, in Genesis 1, where it says the Spirit of God hovered over the deep, inspecting. We see that with Jeremiah, where he's inspecting, creating Jeremiah there in Jeremiah 1. And he knows every hair that's on his head. He calls him to be a prophet before he was even formed in the womb. And so
Yep.
we have these hints of that God is so involved in his creation, and it's just a beautiful thing, and it's just a
Mm-hmm.
good reminder for us that you know even as we are looking at the age of God to answer this question, but we're also hinting into and moving into that God is older than his creation. He loves his creation to the point, he loves you and me to the point that he wants to be involved with us,
Yes.
and intertwined with us, and in relationship with us. And he created and designed us for a very specific person or purpose. And when you look at Genesis 1, that's really the story that I see out of that is that each step of creation builds on each other. And yeah, so how old is God? I don't know. But we do know he's older than his creation.
Yes.
But yet he's not, because there was no age.
And I would just challenge you, don't try to figure it out. I mean, I've heard people take Second Peter, where it's like, a day is like 1,000 years, and a
Right.
thousand is like a day, or I think it's in Isaiah where it says we're just a vapor or a wisp. Okay, there's no mathematical equation to God. Okay, He's trying to help us understand that are in the timeline who He is, and really, it's a matter of just rather than trying to figure out how old God is, I focus more on how I get to dwell with that eternal being on a daily basis.
Right.
I get to commune and spend time with Him, and rather than trying to figure out all of the mysteries, I'm just going to work on trying to understand the mystery of who He is more and more on a regular basis.
And to know that Abraham, Adam and Eve, David, Solomon, Moses, the apostles, they all knew the same exact
Mm-hmm.
God that is the very same, not changed, that we know today,
Yep.
and that you can know. And there's that beauty there. And that's exactly what you're saying. I get to commune and interact. And the truth is that this God saved me, and this God chose me. And that's really the most important thing. So, well, I hope that answers that question. I want to thank you for joining us. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like us to cover, just that's been roaming around in your head, put them in the comments. We'd love to answer those the best that we can. Until next time, see ya.